Hello everybody, it's Greg Hurrell here with another Vim screencast, and today I want to celebrate the release of Neovim version 0.5 by talking about how to move settings over from VimScript to Lua, which is something that you can do quite easily now in Neovim. So the new thing that you can do is you can take your init.vim and instead use init.lua. And obviously you have to change the Vim script into Lua in order for that to work, but it's generally not too bad. So for example, if I show you, I'm going to show you my old vimrc to give you an idea of what this used to look like. So the top pane there is Lua, the bottom pane is VimScript, and basically I just went through, I renamed the file, and from top to bottom I just went in changing VimScript into Lua, which is not super difficult for the kinds of things that most people put in their vimrc files. Now, this particular init file I've got here isn't very representative of a typical vimrc, so I'm going to actually switch to a different file so we can look at something that is a bit more representative. So this is my settings.lua file, previously settings.vim. So let me actually get that open as well. So settings.vim, as you can see, is a VimScript file down the bottom here with a bunch of settings, about 232 lines of settings, and that is I ported that to about 124 lines of Lua. Now the reason why it is shorter is partly because I wrote it more densely and more uniformly, so there's fewer blank lines in the Lua one. To be honest, there's probably not necessarily a huge amount of rhyme or reason in why I have blank lines in some places in the VimScript version. But yeah, I trimmed off quite a few blank lines. But I think the real reason why the Lua one is much shorter is because there's a lot of conditionals that I was able to get rid of. So if you look through the VimScript one, you can see I've got a lot of feature detection and feature sniffing to make sure that the version of Vim that the file is being evaluated by actually has support for the features that are being manipulated, etc. And so you can basically strip away most or all of these conditionals in the Lua version, because in Neovim, the baseline for what's enabled tends to be much higher, and you don't have to worry about running on ancient versions of Neovim because well, there weren't any. So that's one reason, at least in my book, for why to switch to Lua for your config. There are two others though. One is that it might be faster because Lua is fast and VimScript is slow. Having said that, setting settings isn't the slowest thing in the world. So maybe the VimScript version takes a millisecond to evaluate, and the Lua version takes a hundredth of a millisecond. But I'll take it, even if it is micro optimization. I haven't measured it though. I'm just speculating. The second reason why I think it's a good idea to port stuff to Lua is because Lua is a real programming language, and if you learn it and become comfortable with it and become comfortable with the Vim APIs, it opens up this whole world of possibility for you in terms of making your own plugins. A world which would be much harder to get into if you were going to use VimScript alone, because VimScript is a very quirky language, and sure, it is a real, quote-unquote, real programming language. It's Turing complete and you can do a bunch of stuff in it. It has a lot of features, but it's so quirky, and the only place you can use it is in Vim, whereas if you learn Lua, you can use it in a bunch of places. So I view it as a useful investment. And those are the reasons why I'm choosing to rewrite this stuff in Lua. So before I go through and show you some of the mechanics of how to do this with your own settings, I want to talk a little bit about how and when these files get evaluated. If you look here, you'll see that I've got a bunch of files here in a plugin directory, and what I've basically done is split out my vimrc into multiple files with names so that I can jump directly to a section that I care about by going to that file. It's just kind of like an organizational principle. And so Vim is going to go through and load these files one by one during boot time. And you can see here that the only one that I've ported to Lua at this time is the settings.lua. So let's have a look using the script names command and see what order Vim actually loaded these files in. So it starts by grabbing a few files, and then it's going through the ft-detect directories. Then you can see it's pulling in ft-detect files from plugins, and so on until after a while it eventually gets down to that plugin directory that I was just showing you. So that would be here. Abbreviations is the first file that gets included, and then you can see it proceeds in basically alphabetical order. And you can also see that files can require other files to be loaded. So for example, in goyo.vim, I'm obviously calling an autoloaded function, which is causing autoload winsent plugin.vim to be loaded. But then Vim goes back once it's loaded that and proceeds to load things in the order that it was already loading things. It's obviously doing a depth first traversal because you can see how it goes down into plugin mappings and the default files in that subdirectory before popping out again and proceeding. And here we get to status line. Now, before I ported settings.lua, it was settings.vim, and you would have seen it right here. But now that it's Lua, it's nowhere to be seen. You can see that Vim basically went through this directory in alphabetical order. Now, I'm not sure whether that's because the file system returned the files in that order or because Vim sorts. But whatever the case, it is doing it in alphabetical order. And settings.vim is settings.lua is not there. So the question is, where is it? And we have to go quite a bit further down before we find it. There it is, on line 107. You can see that it finally got to the point of evaluating settings.lua. Like this is about 50 files later in the process. So the stuff in here is loading considerably later than it would have in the normal kind of Vim script-based boot process. That's something to bear in mind because when you change options in Vim, it's quite possible that those options will influence the behavior of code that is evaluated after you set the options. And so if I'm evaluating 100 files, it's quite possible that there's something in there that might be different depending on whether or not I set options before or after. Definitely something to bear in mind, and I did run into one thing that I had to be careful about in porting my settings.vim to settings.lua because of this ordering issue. If you look here, it looks like line 109 is the first file where we're pulling something from the so-called after directory. Now, the after files are things that should happen at the very end of the boot process. So you can tell from this that the Lua stuff is getting loaded like really late in the boot process. It's almost like the last thing to get loaded. Well, it is the last thing to get loaded before the after files start loading. So definitely something to bear in mind. All right, but with that, I think we can get back to the actual business of how do you port these things. And so what I'm going to do, I'll show you what I did. I won't redo the whole thing because it's 200 lines. I'll show you the original file, and I'll basically show you the procedure that I went through and show some basic patterns that you can follow to do the same. So the first thing I did was rename the file. So let's do that. So let's make it settings.lua. And the whole thing lights up like a Christmas tree because suddenly we've got a Lua file with a bunch of invalid syntax in it. And the LSP is obviously complaining and telling me all the things that are wrong. Now, when I went through and did this, I started at the top and I went down line by line. And I left all these warnings on because it helped me spot errors as I was going. But because this is really hard to look at, I'm actually going to start a new buffer. So I'm going to yank this text, I'm going to create a blank file, I'm going to paste into this. So this has no file type and the LSP is not going to complain. I'm just doing it this way so that we can look at it without getting distracted by all the crap. Now, as I said, I worked from top to bottom and I did it one item at a time because I wanted to kind of think about each item I was changing. But if you have a very structured kind of VMRC, you might actually be able to do some things that are relatively automated. So for example, just say all those Vim comments, I could change them to, actually let's do something like start of the line or a blank space followed by a quote followed by other stuff. Let's change that to dash the thing that it was followed by, right? So that would be an example. I changed all the Vim comments to Lua comments in one go. I'm using a kind of a bulk operation. But anyway, in real life, I went through one line at a time, just being careful here. We don't need the script encoding call in Lua, so I'll get rid of that. This first case here is an example of a Boolean setting, like you just want to turn something on. So the way you would do that in Lua with the Lua API is to do vim opt auto indent equals true. The next one we have is a string setting. So we're going to do something very similar there. Basically vim.opt equals and assign the string. This next one looks like a Boolean, but it isn't because backup copy, which is something I actually did a screencast on not that long ago, is a trinary kind of setting. It can be yes, no, or auto. So those are strings. So this one's a string. Next example here, no backup. So that's a Boolean, but this time it's a negation. So for this one, we're going to do vim opt, whoops, and we're going to basically get rid of the no and assign it false, right? So we've seen now how to do both positive and negative Booleans. Next one is this pattern here. As you can see, the set command accepts this plus equals syntax, which enables you to augment a setting or add to it. There's also a minus equals and maybe some others like for toggling, but in my Vim I see I only ever use plus and minus. So basically, you know, when you set a setting and then append to it in this way, it's equivalent to having written like a set of comma separated values, right? So I can write foo comma bar, or I can just do set backup dir plus equals bar. And why would you want to do that? Well, one might be because the options are hard to read when they're all mashed together. Another might be that they're too long, so the line wraps awkwardly. And yet another would be that, you know, maybe you want to have a comment explaining each line, right? So here, to port this, we can use this pattern. We can do our initial assignment. Whoops. One thing to bear in mind here is that for a lot of these options, if you use a tilde in Vim script, that is not going to cut it in Lua. You actually have to expand the tilde. So, for example, if I look at the current value of this, oh my god, when I move my hands, I put my hands on the keyboard and they're not in the home row anymore, and then they're not pressing the right keys. So if I look at the value of this setting right now, oh, that one was okay. Let's look at another directory-like one. Directory. Oh. I wonder if this is a version-specific thing, because this was not behaving like this on my other computer. What about view? No, none of them have this. No, whatever. On the version of Vim that I'm using on my other machine, I definitely found that I needed to expand the tilde. So we can do that we can call any Vim function we want, right? So I'm going to do that. So that's going to turn the tilde into an absolute path to my home directory. So the pattern then for appending to this is probably not all that surprising. We can go here and we can grab the previous value of vim opt backup dir, and we can append a new value to it like that. So at this point, it's probably worth diving into what is this vim opt backup dir, what kind of thing is it? So let's actually print that out so you can see for yourself. Vim opt backup dir. It's a Lua table, so it's an object. It's not just a string like you might have expected it to be. So this table actually defines some special methods, including an override for the plus operator, which basically knows how to handle this kind of appending and turn it into a comma separated kind of value. So if we actually look at what this object really looks like using vim inspect, oops, I didn't mean to do that. That didn't work. That's because I need vim opt here. You'll see that it is a table with some nested tables in it. It's got the value in there, the comma separated value, but it's also got this meta stuff in here, which are where these magical like plus methods are actually coming from, like append. So let's have a look here. You'll notice that one of the methods that's on this special object is a get method. And in the case of this option, it's returning a table as well. So let's inspect that to see what it is. You see it's actually an array, although Lua doesn't have arrays. It has list-like tables and dictionary-like tables. So this is a array-like table containing the options, the different components of the option. So we could also remove something from that array with minus. And as I said, in my VimRC, the only thing I needed to do was plus or minus. But you can also, I think have I not re-indexed my help lately? Let's have a look here. Does this have the Lua vim.opt? Does it have information about this in here? It probably does. You can see prepend and remove. It's not, oh yeah, here you go. It's mentioning about the minus operator and maps, how you can do maps. Oh, that's interesting. That's actually, I might actually be able to use that. So anyway, it's all in the help if you want to know more about it. Let's continue. We've already seen that kind of thing. I already mentioned how I'm able to delete quite a few conditionals because you just don't need them in Neovim. What about this one here? Color column. So let's look at the value of color column. As you can see, it's this horrible big long string of comma separated values. So I don't want to put that huge long line on my Vim. I want to programmatically generate it. So the way I was doing it on the Vim side is to use the join and range calls. And this L colon thing, I don't actually know why I do know why I was doing it that way. This is equivalent to set local color column, which I would have to pass a literal value to. And because I want to pass a computed value, I've got to use let. So that's what I was doing on the Vim side. But on the Lua side, I can do Vim opt local color column equals, and then basically, this stuff here. But these are Vim script functions, so to call them, I've got to call them as vim.fn. Now, because I've got 200 lines to do, right? So I could have ported this to idiomatic Lua, because sometimes there's a more direct way to do stuff in Lua. But in this case, I think just calling the built-in Vim functions is fine. The other change I need to make on this line is that the string concatenation operator in Lua is 2 dots, not 1. So let's delete that line and get rid of the get rid of the conditional there too. So let's look for some more stuff that's different, because we've already seen quite a few cases. This would be an example. This would be that, I think that would be the dictionary type stuff that we just saw in the help, that I would be able to take advantage of, but I'm not going to in the screencast. Then there's this one here. This is an interesting one. When I first ported this, I actually made a mistake. So basically I did vim opt fold text equals this, and it looks like a call to a Vim function, right? So I thought, well, I better call that function. So I did vim command call and then the function. But this is completely wrong, because the purpose of the fold text option is to basically provide a string for later evaluation. The default here is fold text parentheses. Notice it's a string. It's not a function call. It is a description of how a function would be called. So immediately and eagerly calling like this just simply doesn't work. And so what I actually had to do, believe it or not, in this case was just that. Just pass the string in. That would have worked. More deletable stuff. I'm just going to move a little bit more quickly now, because I think there are a few more things that are worthy of comment. Basically went all the way down the file. Okay, yeah, I could show this. I've got a couple of places where I care about, like, was I invoked as Neovim or Vim or VI? So those would become, that would be vim.v.program. So this is how you look up Vim specific variables. If that is not equal to VI, then do something. So Lua conditionals have then on the end, and they have end instead of endif. So it's pretty straightforward, that one. It's going to be, once again, vim opt, just like that. And I think the last thing probably to show here before I move to another buffer is that you may also see in some places vim.o instead of vim opt. So let me just put that in there. What's the difference? We've already seen that vim opt followed by an option name returns this kind of rich object with methods on it. Vim.o just returns the value itself. So for example, if I do Lua, print vim opt soft tab stop, I get that Lua table. And to pull the value out of it, I actually have to call the get method. But if I just do vim.o, it is going to just give me the value directly. So the two use cases for these different modalities, the opt one is really about manipulating options. It's about setting them, removing things from them, augmenting them, whereas vim.o is just for quick and dirty reads. So a good example of where you might want to do that is, for example, with an option like lines, or columns. So this tells me the number of lines in my buffer. So columns is similar. Now, usually I just want to read that value and do something with it from some kind of plugin, right? And so for that one, that would be a good use case to use O as opposed to opt. Whereas in your vimrc, you're probably going to be using opt. for most of the options. All right, so I've got a clean work tree. I'm actually going to pull at this point because I made some changes since on another machine. So basically, given that I noticed that I had this order dependency thing going on, I figured, like, why have settings.lua happening super late? And I actually decided to move all that into my init.lua. So I'll show you what that looks like now. My init.lua now looks like this. And because it's bigger now, it's now 300 lines long, I turn on folding. So I've got these manual fold markers in here. And you can see, basically, I've divided my VMIC into sections, and I can jump around like that. So the way this is done, usually I have fold methods set to indent, but in this file, I've got it set to marker via a mode line. And then these markers here, these little triple curlies, those are what defines where the fold areas start, right? So I can basically just hide things like that. With all of that stuff that I just talked about up the top, the Vim ops, very early on in the boot process. Now, of all the options I changed, I think there were only 2 or 3 that were tricky. So let's look at those. Let's look at those if I can remember what they were. Field chars was definitely one. So field chars, if you look here, this is dim, so it's hard to see, but you can provide this EOB override to change the character which is shown beyond the end of the buffer. Right, so if I go to the end of this buffer, normally in Vim on the left here, there'd be a series of tildes down the bottom showing that there are no lines in this buffer, but I don't like that because that's noisy, right? So I have that turned off, and the way I'm suppressing it in Lua is with a non-breaking space, it renders invisibly. In the old Vim script version, what I did was something along the lines of set field chars plus equals EOB blank. And so that enabled me to set a space. And I found that I couldn't do that in Lua. Like if I had literally, like, if I just gave it a space, like, ASCII 20, like it didn't, is it ASCII 20? Anyway, if I gave it a literal ASCII space, it just didn't work at all. If I gave it a backslash, it showed me the backslash instead of what I wanted. If I left it completely blank, like an empty string, then it threw an error. So basically, this is the only way I could get that to work. That was the first tricky one. What was the next tricky one? It was wild charm, wasn't it? So in Vim script, I was able to assign a string for this. So I was able to write Control Z, but I couldn't do that. I could not do that in Lua because if you look at the documentation for wild charm, you'll see it is a number. So I had basically to find out what key code Vim thinks Control Z is. And so the way I did that was by, once again, jumping down into the Lua layer and just getting it to print, like, what is wild charm. And it said 26, and so yeah, that's the value that I plugged back in there. And I think those were the only real issues that I had. So let's have a look here. Oh yeah, this is the one. Settings Vim to settings Lua. So let's see here. We're talking about EOB, talked about wild charm, and we talked about the ordering issue. So yeah, those were the only problems. So this has been a long one. Sorry for that, but I hope it's been useful. And enjoy Neovim 0.5 and the brave new world of Lua, and I'll see you again next time.